Greetings and welcome to week 5 of Confronting Evil in History. Today we're paying attention to one of the earlier evils of the 20th century, but a massive and horrific one. And this was Stalin's war against the kulaks, or war against the peasants of Ukraine in the middle period of the development of the Soviet economy, 1929 to 1933. A simply horrendous period of time in which the economic social goal of collectivization was carried out in a way that was deliberately fashioned to bring about the death by starvation of millions of rural people in Ukraine and other parts of European Russia, including the North Caucasus. This eventually became known as the Holodomor, which is a Ukrainian combination of words meaning death by hunger. 4 million people, as you know from Anne Applebaum's book, 4 million people are estimated to have died of starvation in 1932 to 1933 in the Ukraine, with another 1.5 to 2 million more in North Caucasus and other parts of the European Soviet Union. And the cause of this evil is evident in hindsight. It had to do with the establishment of a ruthless totalitarian regime, the Soviet Union, with virtually unlimited police powers, guided by an ideology that justified any level of violence in support of communism, and a leader, Stalin, who was willing to kill what he called class enemies in vast numbers. The suffering of the Holodomor was horrific and prolonged. Dying by starvation is a particularly horrible way to die. It takes months to finally expire, and for families, it means the adults of the family are wasting away as their children die in front of them. It is a simply horrific way for a few individuals to die, and then understand that this war against the peasants of Ukraine consumed eventually, within a period of about 12 months, consumed 4 million people. The victims, we have to recall this, the victims were all human beings with their own dignity, with lives, with their own passions and commitments, with their families, and everything that they cared about, all destroyed by Stalin's war on the peasantry. Also, it is important to underline that the victims were entirely innocent. They were just farmer families living in villages, growing crops, tending to animals, engaging in gossip over the back fence. They had no political or illegal involvement at all. This action, the extended action of collectivization and forced confiscation of the grain of the region, which is what directly led to the starvation over a period of months. This activity, this process, led to the degradation and dehumanization of 4 million people. The word kulak was used, which is a Russian word which referred to rich peasants, people who were identified to be enemies of the people and were considered by the Soviet regime to be less than human. But what is really striking is the fact that the vast majority of the people who died by starvation during the Holodomor were by no means rich peasants. They were simply ordinary farmers with small plots of land, 1 or 2 cows, 1 or 2 pigs, just small farmers who were innocent victims of the Soviet regime. And then we have to underline that the suffering and death that occurred in 1932 and 1933 was deliberately imposed on the victims through the decisions, policies, and actions, the purposive actions of the Soviet state. In terms that John Keats uses, and I think they're important to underline here, the crime of the Holodomor was wholly inexcusable. So why did it occur? Stalin's plan for agriculture in the 1920s was a communist plan, and it involved collectivization of agriculture along the lines of industrial collectivization. And collectivization meant the creation of large farms with hundreds of farm laborers in place of small family farms. So large units might be 1,000 acres of land or 200 hectares of land, and then hundreds of farm workers who performed different tasks on the collective. But Stalin viewed the peasants of Ukraine and the North Caucasus as the enemies of the state, counter-revolutionaries, quote, determined to defeat Soviet communism. And it is true that peasants in Ukraine and other parts of rural Soviet Union objected to this radical transformation of their economic and social lives. This was not a willing transformation. It was not a democratic transformation. It was a transformation that was, even under the best of circumstances, without starvation, it was imposed on rural society through the force of arms. But in 1932, Stalin made a deliberate decision to crush the, quote, kulaks by violence and by forcible seizure of grain, farm animals, and all other necessities of life in the countryside, taking all the grain. No grain was left in the villages or in the homes to get the families through the hungry period, including the seed grain. The seed grain was also confiscated. The animals were taken away, and there was no food at all available in the rural villages and rural locations. And by 1932, mass starvation was underway, leading to 4 million deaths in Ukraine and another 2 million elsewhere. Robert Conquest is a British historian who was one of the first to describe the facts of the Holodomor in an important book of history on the Holodomor. And his descriptions continue to hold up, and Anne Applebaum also refers to his descriptions. I won't read this quote, but you can see it in the slides. But there were journalists and travelers who traveled through Ukraine in 1932 and 1933 who gave honest portrayals of what was occurring. That's an important point to underline, because there were other journalists, including journalists of the New York Times, who concealed and obfuscated the realities of the Holodomor, who concealed, really, who made as if there was no starvation, that these were myths that were being created by people who hated communism. But Malcolm Muggeridge was a left-oriented British activist and journalist and author, and, by the way, spy during World War II. And Malcolm Muggeridge traveled as a journalist to Moscow, but then had heard rumors of hunger and starvation in the Ukraine. And so he traveled without permission to the Ukraine and conveyed his observations to a series of 4 columns in a British newspaper. I'll just read one paragraph of this. A little market town in the Kuban district. There were soldiers everywhere, well-fed. The civilian population, though, was obviously starving. I mean starving in its absolute sense, not undernourished, but having had for weeks next to nothing to eat. Later, I found out there had been no bread at all in the place for 3 months. You can't survive for 3 months with no food. So these people are wasting away and dying. But then he makes another important point. This is not an accident, this famine. This famine is an organized one. The proletariat, represented by the GPU, by the secret police, and the military, has already routed its enemies among the peasantry who tried to hide a little bit of their produce to feed themselves. The worst of the class war is that it never stops. First, individual kulaks were shot and exiled, then groups of peasants, then whole villages. It is literally true that whole villages have been exiled. Here are the unfortunate people from a Ukrainian village on the march, hoping to find food somewhere else, but doomed. almost all of these people will die of starvation in this photograph from 1932. Another traveler whose work I appreciate very much, Arthur Koestler, who wrote the novel Darkness at Noon about the Moscow show trials. But what is significant about Koestler is he was not an opponent of communism. In fact, he was a member of the German Communist Party. He was a journalist and an author. He had been imprisoned in the Spanish Civil War by Franco when he was covering the Spanish Civil War in 1936. He traveled through Ukraine in 1932. And this passage, I think, is worth reading. It's really a powerful and direct and honest passage. There's no effort to sugarcoat or to conceal the realities of what Koestler observed here. The train puffed slowly across the Ukrainian steppe. It stopped frequently. At every station, there was a crowd of peasants in rags, offering icons of linen in exchange against a loaf of bread. The women were lifting up their infants to the compartment windows, infants pitiful and terrifying, with limbs like sticks, puffed bellies, big cadaverous heads lolling on thin necks. I had arrived unsuspecting at the peak of the famine of 1932-33, which had depopulated entire districts and claimed several million lives. Its ravages are now officially admitted, but at the time they were kept secret from the world. The scenes at the railway stations all along our journey gave me an inkling of the disaster, but no understanding of its causes and extent. My Russian traveling companions, members of the party, took pains to explain to me that these wretched crowds were kulaks, rich peasants who had resisted the collectivization of the land and whom it had therefore been necessary to evict from their farms. It's very powerful, its description. Malcolm Muggeridge had a second series of eyewitness accounts, which he published in Britain. And here again, I won't read the passage, but it's in the slides and you can read it yourself. What's important about this is that there was honest journalism at the same time that there was, I suppose you'd have to call it fellow traveler journalism from the West. Westerners who were ideologically supportive of communism and therefore made excuses for Stalin, for Stalinism, for the brutality and violence and evils created by the Soviet regime. Vasily Grossman, the last novel of his life, is a novel called Everything Flows, which he wrote in the last several years of his life. And in Everything Flows, Grossman had succeeded within Soviet Russia, for most of his writing career within Stalinist Soviet Russia. He had managed to maintain his own honesty, his integrity, and his willingness to speak critically of the regime that was in place. And this was highly dangerous. So many of his writer friends had been arrested and imprisoned in the Gulag or shot. And so the fact that Grossman continued to find ways in his writing, in his novels, to write of the crimes of Stalinism is really, to me, just an enormously impressive fact. But here's a short description taken from the novel Everything Flows. And it's worth remembering that Grossman was himself from the Kiev region of Ukraine. So Ukraine and his war journalism, most of his war journalism occurred in Ukraine. So he was very familiar with the terrain and the social circumstances of the Ukraine. This is from a novel, though. It's a piece of fiction based on interviews and discussions which Grossman had with people who were survivors. It was terrible. Mothers looked at their own children and screamed in fear. It was as if they'd seen a snake in the house. And they had seen a snake. They had seen famine, starvation, death. What could they do? No one in the village could think of anything except food. People would suck and move their jaws up and down. The saliva would flow and they'd swallow it down. But you need more than saliva to fill your stomach. If you woke in the night, there wasn't a sound to be heard. No one talking anywhere. No one playing an accordion. The silence of the grave. No footsteps but the footsteps of famine. Famine never slept. First thing in the morning, the children were crying in every hut, asking for bread. And what were their mothers to give them? Snow? There was no help to be had from anyone. The party officials just went on repeating, "You shouldn't have lazed about like that. You should have worked harder." Sometimes they added, "Just look around you. There's enough grain buried here for the next 3 years." It's a powerful passage, a powerful description of the individual suffering which occurred during the Holodomor. So now let's be analytical for our own purposes, confronting evil in history. It's one thing to recognize and empathize with and have compassion for these now long dead Ukrainian peasants, but we also want to ask ourselves, how could this have happened? How could this crime have taken place? And the account that I would like to offer you is that it came fundamentally down to the fact that the Soviet Union, created by Lenin, further developed and perfected by Stalin, that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian state, completely willing to use unlimited violence against its own citizens. All power was in the hands of the Soviet state. There was no, what today we would call effective civil society, where independent organizations can resist the will of the state. But there was also a complete lack of identification between the top bosses, Stalin and his henchmen, and the people. There was a willingness to consign the innocent to death in the most horrific ways. There was also an extensive, and this is really a crucial part of the success of the Soviet Union in carrying out the atrocities that it did, an extensive military police organization that was sufficient to enforce the will of the state and really the will of Stalin and his apparatus, namely the GPU, the NKVD, the KGB. These are different labels for the continuing secret police and security police of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was animated by an ideology that placed achievement of communist society as the highest goal, the purpose of the state. And this ideology also expressed a complete and undaunting willingness to sacrifice the innocent for this goal. A state apparatus finally was developed, which had adequate organizational competence to carry out the plans of repression and punishment which its leaders like Stalin intended for its enemies. So an ideology, a state apparatus, and a system of a very pervasive and extensive system of police and secret police activity led to the ability of the Soviet state to enforce its will throughout its territory and across its whole population. One example of the ruthlessness and complete inhumane brutality of the Soviet Union, as expressed through the NKVD, occurred in 1941, when the Soviets were being pressed out of Ukraine by the invading German armies. And the Soviets had occupied Ukraine and half of Poland at about the time of the invasion by the Nazis of Poland. And the Soviets had gathered up thousands of political prisoners and placed them in prisons around Ukraine, including in Lvov. But when the Soviet Union was faced with an immediate need to retreat, because the Wehrmacht was defeating Soviet forces all along the front, the NKVD then made a decision to prevent the Nazis from either taking over administration or releasing these political prisoners. Instead, they decided to massacre all of them. Massacre, kill, torture and kill all of the prisoners, all of the political prisoners in particular, at the several prisons at which political prisoners had been concentrated. So about 1,700 prisoners were killed in one prison, another 700 or so in a second prison in Lvov. And all of this was done by the NKVD. What is characteristic of a totalitarian regime, and what was absolutely characteristic of the Soviet regime, was its complete willingness to lie and obscure the crimes which it committed. So this is now quoting from the Himka essay, Lansky Prison. Given all the evidence, including NKVD internal reports on the progress of the shooting, in other words, as it was taking place, there can be no doubt that the thousands of prisoners found dead in Lvov prisons in late June and early July 1941 were killed by the NKVD. Nonetheless, and recall, this is massacre of innocent people who are incapable of resisting. They're confined in prison. Returning to the quote, nonetheless, for a very long time, the Soviets denied their responsibility for the murders, blaming instead the Germans, a move most familiar from the case of the Katyn Forest massacres, but also employed in the case of the exhumations of NKVD victims in the Ukrainian city of Vinnytsia. Thus, while collecting information on German war crimes on the territory of Western Ukraine, the Soviets made any witness who mentioned the NKVD murders to ascribe them instead to the Germans. In other words, a systematic effort in almost Orwellian terms to create a big lie about who had committed the atrocity of killing defenseless prisoners in these various prisons under Soviet control. We've referred to totalitarianism. We've had now a nice presentation on totalitarianism. We'll talk about it more, but it's worth dwelling a little bit on it here, because totalitarianism is something new in the 20th century. Stalin himself was a ruthless, horrific criminal. But Stalinism and Soviet communism could not have existed simply through the will of one man alone. Rather, totalitarian regimes are distinctive. They're different from tyrannies and dictatorships in earlier times. The differences are very striking. The apparatus of political prisons, we've just been talking about some placed in Ukraine, the extensive secret police networks, the purpose of use of violent organizations, the ideologies of national and ethnic purity, especially pronounced in the Nazi case, but there is nationalism and ethnic politics in the Soviet Union as well. Most fundamental is the degree and depth of bureaucratic control that the modern totalitarian state achieved. And that is what made the modern fascist or Soviet state total, an ability to monitor and intimidate civil society all the way down to the street level. And we're going to have a couple of examples in just a minute. One important part of that story about the growth of totalitarianism, the development of totalitarianism, is growth of the means of repression, the organized forces available to the state to repress its own citizenry, to punish, to repress, and ultimately kill in many instances. So one piece of this new totalitarian capacity was organizational. Fascist states in Italy, Germany, and also the Soviet Union in the 1930s created bureaucracies of surveillance, enforcement, punishment, and killing that went vastly beyond the capacity of 19th century state organizations. There were dictatorships and tyrannies long before totalitarianism, but this new capacity of surveillance, enforcement, and punishment was something new. And I think in some ways we could make a Foucault-like point about this, about the capacity of the powerful to enforce and surveil, which is an important new development. So the organizations of police and army in Italy, Italian fascism, Spain, Franco-fascism, and Germany took major steps forward in size and complexity in the early part of the 20th century. The personnel of the forces of coercion, police, and other armed forces, such as militias, were few in the 19th century, but by the middle of the 20th century, these numbers have grown exponentially. So let's try to wrap up. What kind of conclusions or observations can we draw out of this consideration of the Holodomor, one of the great evils of the 20th century? I think there are several key insights that we can get from Anne Applebaum's book, but from these other materials which I've presented to you today as well. First is the importance of ideology. The totalizing ideologies that motivated both the Nazi state and also the Soviet totalitarian state, these ideologies were a very important part of the atrocities committed by both totalitarian states. Totalizing ideologies, whether it should be a fundamentalist belief in communism or Christian nationalism or anti-Semitic Nazism, these totalizing ideologies have the capacity to persuade ordinary people of the supreme moral importance of the state over the individual. And this can serve as a powerful catalyst to great evil. True believers are willing to do atrocious things to their fellow human beings, especially when their own careers and well-being depend upon it. A second major factor is the growth and refinement of major organizational tools for exercising the power of a totalitarian state. These tools include especially the creation of powerful and extensive and well-funded security, surveillance, and repression organizations like the secret police, the NKVD, the Gestapo, as well as the effective bureaucratic systems of policy enforcement and implementation that both the Nazi state and the Soviet state succeeded in developing through the history of their political development. These organizational innovations created the capacity that was necessary to carry out massive state-initiated atrocities against civilians and other innocent people. A third observation for us, which is especially important, is the crucial importance of telling the truth about atrocity. Concealment about atrocity, lying about atrocity, like the Katyn Forest Massacre, the Lansky Prison Massacre, and other atrocities of state. This is horrific. And most importantly, it leads to the possibility that we will continue to commit these kinds of atrocities by not understanding them. In this light, Russia's current atrocities, its military atrocities in Ukraine, which are deliberate, cruel, deadly, and unmotivated, these atrocities against civilians are inexcusable and they must be brought to the public's attention. Thanks. We'll talk about all of this on Tuesday.